Yes, Manali ma'am, we can, yeah.
We can begin the session,
Yes,
right?
let's start, yeah.
Let's start. So good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all for today's session, the third day of our conference, and we thank all of you for your collaboration and support that have made this session a reality for us. Thanks a lot to you. And it is indeed a moment of privilege for me to introduce Professor Allison Kavey and Dr. Ray Allen Kavey, City University, New York, John Jay College of Criminal Justice, USA. So we welcome you, ma'am, for this session, and we really thank you for your unconditional academic support that you have extended to us. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
So
should I just go ahead?
Ma'am, before beginning the session, I would just like the audience to know that you are a medical practitioner. That will help them to conceptualize that you'll be talking about medicine today. So that is the focus of our session. So can I talk a little bit about your biography, ma'am? Could you please give me 2 minutes?
Sure.
Thank you.
Of course.
So participants, today we have amidst us Professor Allison Kavey and Dr. Ray Allen Kavey. I would like to briefly introduce you to them. Dr. Ellen Kavey received her medical education at McGill University and State University, New York, Downstate Medical Center. Her pediatric training she received from New York Hospital, Cornell University School of Medicine, and her pediatric cardiology fellowship training at Montreal Children's Hospital and Baptist Hospital, Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. In 1977, she joined the Division of Pediatric Cardiology at State University, New York, and she rose through the ranks to become a full professor there. In 2009, she joined the Division of Pediatric Cardiology at the University of Rochester Medical Center, from which she retired 5 years ago. At present, she is engaged in the study of epidemics in the context of the history of medicine and joined the faculty at City University, New York, John Jay College of Criminal Justice in the Department of History, where she is an adjunct professor. Welcome, ma'am. We welcome you to this session, and over to you, ma'am. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us to participate. It's a great pleasure to be part of such a well-organized and timely conference. And I'm just going to shift over to slides, something I'm very used to. Let's see if I can find it now. There we go. And let's see if I can get this to work now. So I love your title. And today I'm going to be speaking in the context of virtuality, personal branding, and the humanities education in the post-COVID era. I'm going to be looking at the view from science and medicine. And from my standpoint, the view from science is that knowledge is power. In science and in medicine, facts are paramount, so identifying strengths and weaknesses of an adversary are critical. In medicine, the adversary is the disease pathogen, and knowing that enemy begins with marshaling all that we know from the past. So right away, we're right into medical history. In my opinion, learning the historic approach is a useful way to understand the scientific approach to a problem and to acquire the skills needed to address any new problem. In terms of science and humanities students, most of my humanities students tell me they're not really interested in taking a science course, but it's a requirement, so they're there. And they don't hesitate to tell me that. I believe that knowing what was known at a point in the past represents understanding the context of contemporaneous medical and scientific knowledge at that time. And looking at how knowledge developed subsequently provides a framework for contending with a new problem, whatever the setting. For the last 5 years, I've been fortunate to teach a completely asynchronous online course to undergraduate humanities students who need a science exposure. I've been using Blackboard, the online learning system, and I think this is the kind of system that's very compatible with post-COVID education. My rationale for using epidemics to teach science is that a focus on the history of an epidemic gives students a focal point from which to survey the state of science and medicine in cultural and societal context. And each new epidemic can be presented as a step forward in scientific knowledge and medical practice. An entire course built around this scaffold leaves students with sound scientific knowledge of the evolution of science and medicine over time, and the critical thinking skills to address the next scientific problem they face. This is the format of the course. I set the context, the historic state of medicine and science at that time. I review the pathogen and the disease. We look at progress that was derived as a result of that pandemic. And then I use assignments of various kinds to try to get the students really involved with this course. So I begin by selecting the pandemics that I'm going to use, and I've highlighted the two that I'm going to talk about a bit today, cholera and COVID-19, so that we can have, I use those as examples, but the entire course is a different epidemic each session. And I almost always begin with the plague and cholera because those provide a really strong foundation for the whole course. I'm going to give you a mini perspective of this experience, I hope, this morning, so you'll see the way I teach the course and the way I think it works. Cholera is a bacterial disease caused by infection with the bacteria Vibrio cholera. The infection occurs by fecal oral contamination, usually consumption of contaminated water. About 20% of those infected develop catastrophic diarrhea as a result of a potent toxin produced by the bacteria. A patient with cholera can lose as much as 50 quarts of fluid in a day. Without treatment, the fluid loss is so severe that patients quickly become severely dehydrated with secondary collapse of the circulation. In the 1800s, when cholera caused recurrent severe epidemics, almost half of cholera victims died. Historically, multiple cholera epidemics beginning in the early 1800s were carried along shipping trade routes from the Ganges in India to Europe. There were a series of pandemics. The first arrival in Britain was in 1831 and London in 1832, with subsequent major outbreaks over time. And it's the London epidemic that occurred in 1854 that we focus on in the course. London at that time, and you can see it depicted here on the slide, on the left-hand panel, this is a photograph of an oil painting of just how the streets looked, the incredible crowding and filth of the streets. And then on the right, a woodcut. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. London at that time was very different from the sophisticated cosmopolitan metropolis that we know now. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution beginning in 1700, there had been a dramatic increase in population, which had tripled over the preceding 50 years. Unfortunately, there was no comparable increase in the systems for removal of human waste. Primitive cesspools in the basements of buildings were simply used to collect sewage, and overflow accumulated directly in the streets. London did have an ancient drainage system dating back to the time of Henry VIII, which was designed to carry surface water like rainfall into the Thames. As the city's population exploded, more and more houses discharged their waste directly into this primitive sewer system. And in the woodcut on the right, you can see people literally throwing pails of whatever out into the street. One can only imagine the filth and the terrible stench recorded in every description of the city at that time. With continuous contamination of the major water supply, the Thames, the stage was set for cholera epidemics. The 1854 epidemic began in the Golden Square area north of the Thames. On August 28th, a 6-month-old baby fell ill with vomiting and diarrhea. Her mother rinsed out her diapers and tossed the water directly into the cesspool in front of her house. This was immediately adjacent to the public water pump for the area. 4 days later, a tailor who lived 2 doors down became violently ill with profound diarrhea. By the time he died, Less than 2 days later, hundreds of residents had been seized by cholera. Yellow flags were posted on the street to indicate that cholera had struck, and priests and doctors rushed from one house to the next, trying to bring comfort to the dying and the survivors. It was in this dramatic scene of catastrophe and death that Dr. John Snow investigated his own theory of cholera causation. In 1854, the dominant theory of disease causation was the miasma theory, that illnesses like cholera were caused by a noxious form of bad air. This was certainly easy to believe given the stench that surrounded cities during that time. Although the concept of contagion arose with the plague, the germ theory of disease had not yet been accepted. As a physician and a keen observer of illness, Dr. Snow developed a theory that cholera was caused by drinking water contaminated by an unknown contagion. At that time, death records were published every week, and Snow used these statistics to create a detailed map of the cholera cases. And this is an actual copy of the map, and each one of these little black rectangles, here's a single one over here, represents a case. And the big arrow indicates the pump that really you can see even just at this stage is the center of the area. Dr. Snow visited all the homes and businesses in the area, and by questioning the local residents, he established the pattern of the disease outbreak. Ultimately, he identified a single common denominator for all the cases. Each used the pump on Broad Street as their source of drinking water. He also evaluated homes in the area where no cases of cholera developed and verified that these sites, most famously a brewery where the workers drank only beer, did not use water from the pump. In his own words, the result of the inquiry then is that there has been no particular outbreak or prevalence of cholera in this part of London except among the persons who were at the habit of drinking the water of the above-mentioned pump. The pump handle was removed and the epidemic ended. John Snow's work is regarded as the founding event of epidemiology, the science that studies the patterns of disease in defined populations. His work also demonstrated powerfully the importance of safe drinking water. Even though he could not identify the germ, Dr. Snow's investigation was a clear demonstration of the germ theory of disease. His methods remain the essence of epidemiologic investigation. Now, with this background at this point in the course, I ask students to review an analysis of a disease outbreak. This is an actual report of an outbreak of stomach flu that occurred at a college in Texas. I asked the students to walk through the steps of a disease outbreak investigation and create a report of their findings as if they were the investigator. So these are the steps of the disease outbreak that I asked them to follow. And you may know that you begin by establishing the existence of an outbreak, easy in this case. You construct a case definition by asking a series of key questions like you're a reporter on the ground. Who is sick? What happened? Where are they? When did their illness begin? How did they get sick? And that gives you kind of a working definition of the case problem that defines the outbreak. Then I asked the students to find the cases and record them in a graph to visualize the disease pattern. Now, John Snow used a map to do this. And they go on to prioritize the severity of the outbreak, analyze their data, hopefully find the cause, create an intervention, and report their findings. This is just an example of the kind of graph that you can get in this circumstance where over a period of a few days, the number of cases increases dramatically and then tails off as the cause is identified and no further cases arise. We now are going to have a brief pause while we shift gears and talk about the basics of virology, because global health in the 21st century faces unprecedented challenges from powerfully, highly pathogenic viruses. All the pandemics of the last century were caused by viruses. These invisible but enormously powerful agents have already caused a series of terrifying disease outbreaks. Since just the year 2000, we have faced the continuing global spread of HIV/AIDS, the SARS pandemic, a global influenza pandemic with a newly emerged H1N1 strain, MERS, the global spread of Zika with its devastating prenatal consequences, and now ongoing Ebola pandemics. I spend time on this with students because most are unfamiliar with the power of viral pathogens and also are not aware of the series of pandemics that have arisen caused by viruses just over the last 20 years. A virus is the most basic known living thing. They're the smallest and simplest of known infectious agents, a simple protein shell with an RNA or DNA genome. They're extremely small, only visible by electron microscopy, and they're obligate parasites. They cannot survive outside a host. They're immobile on their own. So how is this tiny, immobile parasite able to cause severe pathologic disease? This is just a basic virus diagram, and I think of them almost like tiny bubbles with just a little core of nucleic acids. These are the pathogenic characteristics that make viruses so dangerous. Once a host cell contact is made, the virus inserts its own genome and takes over cell functions, and this results in a multitude of new virions flooding the body. Ongoing spontaneous mutation by two different methods leads to an endless series of antigenically novel viruses. With zoonotic transmission, viruses can jump across the species barrier from animals to humans, and that always leads to a completely new virus. And viruses can be sustained in animal or human reservoirs with no evidence of disease, and that's an ongoing source for dangerous new pathogens. So these three characteristics in red are the things that make viruses so dangerous. There are three essential requirements for a global pandemic to occur: emergence of a new agent that infects humans, little or no population immunity to that agent, and easy pathogen transmission from person to person. And you can see that the top two are present to a greater or lesser extent in every virus. Now we're going to move on to look at COVID-19, and since we're living through this pandemic, all of us are quite familiar with many aspects of the disease, but I try to bring it back to look at the state of medicine and science at this time, which means all over the globe, scientists and doctors are working as hard as they can to figure out what's going on. We have a huge armamentarium of tools to deal with evaluating an epidemic like this, and yet I think you probably know how slowly new information is emerging as we deal with a brand new virus. And with this evolving pandemic, epidemiologic graphs like the one the students created with cholera are used to display the spread of this pandemic on media every day. In December of 2019, an outbreak of a mysterious pneumonia characterized by fever, dry cough, and fatigue presented in individuals who worked or shopped at a seafood market in Wuhan, China. At that time, 66% of all the workers in that market were infected with the disease. On December 31st, the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission announced the outbreak and alerted the World Health Organization. Only 1 week later, Chinese scientists identified a novel coronavirus from lung specimens. The new virus was a coronavirus very similar to the original SARS that caused a pandemic in 2004. Coronaviruses are large RNA viruses. Bats are the reservoir for this species, and they can jump across species to infect humans. SARS and MERS have already caused severe epidemics of respiratory illnesses in the last 20 years, and SARS-CoV and SARS-CoV-2, this being the virus that is causing COVID-19, are very similar with the same surface protein spike and host cell receptor. And this is just a diagram of SARS-CoV-2. This is the surface spike that allows the virus to attach to human cells at a specific receptor called the ACE2 receptor, and that's the same receptor used by the SARS virus. One of the critical things about this virus that we've discovered over time is its capacity for transmission. I think everybody knows, because we're going to be wearing masks if we go anywhere, that there's direct spread by droplets through close contact with oral and nasal secretions, and indirectly via contact with droplets on surfaces. Aerosolized droplets during medical procedures increase the infection risk for healthcare providers. Hand hygiene and personal protective gear are protective and do reduce transmission. But here's a critical factor. Transmission can take place before symptom onset. People are contagious 2 days before symptoms begin and in the early days of the illness. So all of a sudden, we have the 3 essential requirements for a global pandemic. Emergence of a new agent that infects humans, little or no population immunity to that brand new agent, and in this case, no population immunity, and easy pathogen transmission from person to person. SARS-CoV-2 has them all, and it also has extra transmission power because of asymptomatic spread. The disease itself was described by the Chinese right from the outset, and those characteristics have persisted pretty much over time. The median age of severe cases is 55 to 59 years, very few less than 15, and there's been a male predominance throughout. 80% of cases are mild, and now we know that about half of those are asymptomatic. 15% are severe, 5% are critical. The most common symptoms are fever in 80% of patients, cough in 70%, and shortness of breath in 30%. There's bilateral pneumonia in 75% of cases on X-ray or CT scan. Overall, the case fatality rate at early in the pandemic was around 2%, but it's increased dramatically with age. 8% in patients between 70 and 79, and 15% in patients over 80. Among those with clinically critical disease, mortality in the early days was 50%. This pandemic spread very rapidly. And you can see here, these are the dates across the bottom. And here we see the curve of cases in red and of deaths in black. And over just the first month of the disease, you can see how quickly the exponential curve was created. On January 23rd, the authorities placed a complete lockdown on Wuhan, eliminating all forms of transportation and effectively sealing off the city. Other cities in the same province rapidly instituted their own travel restrictions, putting much of the province of 59 million people in a de facto lockdown. Unfortunately, by then, an estimated at least 5 million people had already left the city for the Lunar New Year holiday, and this is how initial spread occurred. Even after the lockdown was put in place, case numbers grew exponentially. By January 25th, confirmed cases in mainland China, and here you can see the spread of cases outside of Wuhan. This is when the lockdown occurred, and you can see cases just spread throughout China. By January 25th, there were 2,000 cases in China, but there were already multiple cases outside of China, linked to travel to the Wuhan area or contact with travelers. As of February 6th, and this graph ends somewhere in here towards the end of February, a total of 28,000 confirmed cases with 565 deaths globally were documented by the World Health Organization, involving at least 25 countries. Now, at this point, I asked the students to consider to bring in to their discussion board post a graph of some aspect of the pandemic. And this gives me a chance to reflect back on the cholera lessons and to look at the way this pandemic is spreading in real time. So I'm going to show you some of the curves that have been used in the course. In early March, just as the disease was ending, the initial outbreak, was ending in mainland China, right here. It began in other parts of the world. You can see it, this steep swing in cases in South Korea and in Iran, and then eventually all over the world. This is Italy, the United States, and Spain. The outbreak in Italy is emblematic of what happened subsequently. A cluster of cases in the northern Lombardy region became a major outbreak with 1,000 confirmed cases by March the 1st. Case numbers and deaths rose dramatically, and a nationwide shutdown was imposed on March 4th. In a foreshadowing of outbreaks all over the world, emergency and hospital services were completely overwhelmed with shortages of protective equipment, beds, ventilators, and personnel. Military trucks were conscripted to transport bodies to morgues in nearby towns. Literally tons of medical equipment and teams of physicians from all over the world arrived to help with the catastrophic situation. The outbreak peaked with more than 6,000 new cases and 760 deaths on April 1st, followed by a slow decline with a gradual easing of restrictions. As of mid-July, there have been 245,000 cases and 35,000 deaths in Italy due to COVID-19. So this pattern of the Italian outbreak was mimicked in all the other countries that you see here and in many that are not shown. Meanwhile, the United States, in the United States, there was one early effort by the administration, a February 2nd travel ban to prevent entry of foreign nationals with recent travel to China. But this was followed by a month of inaction when only a handful of cases were detected because of very limited testing. During this time, a significant outbreak occurred in New York City, and this curve comes from the Northeast, but it's very similar to the curve that occurred in New York City alone, where early infections were acquired not from Chinese contacts, but from European travelers. Case numbers grew exponentially. On March 20th, there were 5,600 cases in New York City, and the governor issued a statewide shelter-in-place order. Only 5 days later, over 17,800 cases had been confirmed. Major efforts to expand healthcare facilities included creation of a field hospital in Central Park, use of Navy ships offshore in New York Harbor. Severe shortages of equipment occurred, as they had all over the world. The city's infection rate was 5 times higher than the rest of the country, with 1/3 of total confirmed US cases. Explosive growth in cases and deaths continued until April 12th, and you can see that right here on the curve, when all of a sudden you begin to see a decline, and that continues all the way out into July when there are hardly any cases here in New York City. This is the graph that I find the most worrying. This is a contemporary graph from here in the middle of July, and it shows new cases per 1 million residents over the preceding week. And here at the top, you can see in red, the US curve, the early peak, similar to what we saw on the Northeast curve, but then it never really goes down, and then this tremendous burst in cases beginning in the middle of June. The yellow curve is from Sweden, where they never did a real shelter-in-place order. And you can see that their curve at all the way across is still quite high, but then they did institute masks and a big drop. And here at the bottom, in purple, we can see Canada and Europe, early rise in cases, and then a really significant diminution with the shelter-in-place orders. This is an ongoing pandemic, and none of us know how it's going to end. Certainly, COVID-19 has proven to be a galvanizing force for my students this year, not least because the final trajectory remains impossible to predict. Despite some signs of progress in Europe and parts of the United States, the pandemic roars on with rising caseloads in multiple US states and dramatic increases in case numbers and deaths in South America and Africa. I believe giving students the science basics to understand the dynamics of pandemics is an effective way to introduce vital basic scientific knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kavey, for this presentation, which actually helps us to understand how we can integrate scientific knowledge in the humanities classroom that will help our students to sensitize, as you have correctly said, the dynamics of epidemics, ma'am. Thanks a lot. May I now request the participants to ask any question that you would like to know from Dr. Kavey?
Oh, here's my last slide. This is our book of viral pandemics.
Participants? Any question, observation, anything that you would like to know from ma'am? Perhaps I would like to ask, I have a query, ma'am. Dr. Kavey, when you were trying to help us understand the historical understanding of the pandemics, right from the 1800, when we had a pandemic outbreak in the London city, so, and now when we have COVID-19, that is a lived reality for us. So how do you like to compare the notion of panic that was generated at the time when many pandemics were the human civilization encountered with the present pandemic that we're living today? The panic that is created.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And certainly, I think even back in the 1800s, there was a tremendous role for the media in both exaggerating or emphasizing certain aspects of the pandemic and then, or minimizing them. And one of the things that I think has emerged from this pandemic, especially with COVID, has been the importance of accurate scientific information being delivered to people. And one of the differences, which we certainly have appreciated here in the United States, has been how confusing it has been to get mixed and inaccurate information on the media. And that results in panic and confusion across the population. Accurate information and a plan for how to deal with it is something that can be seen both happening and not happening in pandemics over time.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot for your response. Actually, every day, whenever I open the internet and try to go through the updates of COVID-19, it actually triggers the pandemic. It partly offshoots the fear that I might also be affected by the virus, or my family might be getting affected by the virus. This is something which we all are encountering today. And thank you for helping us understand how media also plays a very significant role here. Thank you. Dr. Borah, would you like to ask a question to ma'am?
No, it's just there's an observation, Manali ma'am, Dr. Kavey talked about, the pandemic. Actually, it brings some kind of, maybe I'm very scared now, seeing the slides and seeing the graphs going up. And imagine a country like India where 1.4 billion people. I don't know how to contain it. We don't know. It's so unpredictable. The virus is so erratic. So it is like, giving me goosebumps actually after listening to.
Yeah, you raised such an excellent point, because it is hard not to be worried when you see curves like the ones that are my students are actually bringing in. The students are actually using curves like this. And it hasn't been very hard to get them engaged this year in this course. Other years, talking about things that happened in the past, it can be harder. But with this happening now to us, it's been very easy to get them engaged. But nonetheless, even teaching pandemics of the past, I think it is possible to really get them engaged in some of the assignments, like the one of creating their own graph of an epidemic, allows them to really get a sense of what it's like. In terms of the current situation, I think one thing that's hard to understand is how relentless a virus can be, and how much, that's one of the things I've tried to get across to the students and that I tried to bring today, is how serious viral infections can be. And a virus like this has, because of its ability to transmit so effectively, has resulted in a massive global pandemic, beginning from just a handful of cases in a city in China.
Right.
You're absolutely right, ma'am. And in fact, previous day I was going through the news report where it was said that if India has to go for testing of all the population, it might take 7 to 8 years to actually test and come out with an actual data. That actually further scares us, that is it actually going to end? That is, and I believe after seeing your presentation, that being a science and technology institute, we should also have a course where we are trying to help our students sensitize about the dynamics of epidemics, how it was interpreted in the history and how we're interpreting it now when it is actually a part of our life. So definitely we'll be posing a course in the institute where we'll be asking our students to know about the pandemic and how it can actually influence our life. Thanks a lot, ma'am. Thanks a lot for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. K.
It was a pleasure.
So now I would like to request Professor Allison Kavey, Professor Allison Kavey, to kindly enlighten us with your insights. We're waiting for your presentation.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to maybe take a bit of a broader approach. What you've seen from Dr. Rael and Kavey's talk is the importance of teaching science as part of the humanities and bringing students up to date, even with basic scientific skills, which we tend to associate with maybe grade 8 or 9 biology education. But in fact, many of our students don't get that knowledge for whatever set of reasons. They come into college science averse and humanities averse. And so these basic skills are an important addition to a basic undergraduate education. I'm going to talk today about why we need the humanities more than ever in our university system. And then I'm going to make an argument for the place of the history of medicine and medical humanities as perhaps a critical component of humanities education today. So I'll try not to bore you to death, because I'm sure you've all been justifying your existence quite a bit lately, but I certainly have been. The humanities are facing a crucial moment in our scholarly existence. Increasingly, students are moving away from studying languages, philosophy, literature, and history to join majors that seem better suited to a career trajectory post-graduation. I am certain that I am not the only person in this group who has devoted many hours in meetings with other faculty attempting to justify the place of the humanities in the university. Despite my insistence that the trivium, logic, grammar, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, astronomy, music, and geometry, were the foundation of a medieval education, the majority of my social science colleagues remain totally unconvinced that students need to study them now. They are not moved by the argument that the trivium provides students with control over the art of language and helps them develop into good speakers who use evidence-based arguments in their conversations, while the quadrivium extends the use of logic to the abstract realm and gives students agency over the hidden relationships, governing numbers, and the spheres. I know those relationships are no longer hidden, but I am a Renaissance natural philosopher at heart. The trivium and quadrivium demonstrate the close ties we all know exist between language and mathematics, literature, and science. Mastery of these fundamental skills does not simply provide students with the skills they will need as they enter the work world. It gives them the vocabulary and grammar required to excel in any field. We literally teach the language and structure of knowledge from which all future investigations evolve. But how do we explain this so that more young people entering university will see humanities majors as a ticket into any profession rather than for preparation for a job? I present here two very different arguments, one practical and one idealist, that I hope will prove compelling to you and to my colleagues at CUNY. Here is the practical argument. We know that education, especially a bachelor's degree, is the most important thing someone can achieve in order to improve their social mobility. even with the sobering fact that lower income students enter university less well prepared, often with inadequate funding, and sometimes leave with crippling student loans, the cost of not going to college over a lifetime is staggering. If we use the handy mobility rate metric, which is, quote, the percentage of students from low income backgrounds who improve their lifetime earnings over time compared to their parents, American public universities, such as the California state system and my own City University of New York, are doing amazing work. Georgia State and the University of Central Florida have recently reconfigured their university system and are paving the way for a new direction. They have admitted more low-income students so that the percentage who graduate with the skills to earn more than their parents is even higher than the current leading mobility metric rate of 10%. To give you a comparison, elite institutions such as Harvard admit very few low-income students, and they graduate an even smaller percentage than they admit. But those who graduate are as likely as their peers to enter the very highest income bracket. This demonstrates the tremendous power of an elite institution while reminding us they could serve a lot more lower income students with their very, very large budgets. I have recently asked myself, in the face of this data, what is the substantive difference between CUNY and Harvard? A review of the CVs of my colleagues in the history department at CUNY John Jay College of Criminal Justice proves it is not the quality of the faculty. In my department, over half of us have a PhD from the top 5 programs in the world in our fields, including Yale, Chicago, Johns Hopkins, Columbia, and Cornell. This is equally demonstrated by the faculty in the history department at the CUNY Graduate Center, which takes faculty from the 13 senior colleges, as well as hiring direct line faculty. As a group, we have won Fulbrights, Pulitzers, a Guggenheim, and Folgers. We have NEH grants. We publish with top university presses, Cambridge, Oxford, Cornell, UPenn, and Routledge. So are we not as good at teaching as the people at Harvard? I would contend that in fact we're better. Our students frequently enter our classrooms lacking fundamental skills, such as grammatical English writing, standard essay organization, and the ability to read and assess evidence. They leave with some command over these skills. Not perhaps the perfect command we would like, but a much stronger command of these skills than they had when they came in. On the other hand, the majority of students entering the Ivy League are already outstanding. They enter those hallowed halls having benefited from exceptional middle and high school education, often having done years of extracurricular activities that emphasize research, writing, and rhetoric, and sometimes having received tutoring and research opportunities outside of school that lower income students can only dream about. The improvement they make in their skill sets over their time in Ivy League universities is significantly less than what CUNY students must accomplish before they graduate. Our students seem destined not to catch up. There are 2 reasons for that. They lack an easy command over the trivium, language, logic, and self-presentation that mark them as part of the privileged, educated few when they begin interviewing for jobs or graduate programs. And they lack social connections. Their parents cannot call friends to help them get a summer internship in an elite law firm or a research position in an outstanding laboratory. Their parents likely need their help paying bills, so they cannot accept unpaid internships. Instead, they must go take low-income jobs over the summer and in winter breaks, often working those jobs full-time while attending class. 2 things will make our students able to compete with Ivy League students: a mastery over the humanities, so they command the knowledge and the language of social class, and the skills to read, write, and think well. They also need access to those elite Rolodexes. And I'm proud to say that at CUNY John Jay, we have just managed to get funding for a program that will provide paid internships for our students at some of the most interesting places in New York City, including law firms, HRC, a wonderful group called NYC Together, the Streb Lab for Action Mechanics, and multiple architecture firms as well. This is a very exciting program, and we just secured funding last month. So we're looking forward to that. So this talk focuses, however, on the humanities. If we teach every student the vocabulary of knowledge production and provide them with the skills to generate outstanding research questions, identify appropriate evidence, analyze it well, and write about it clearly, every student re-graduate is a competitive student. Those are humanities skills. We can make every student who walks into a first-year seminar at CUNY competitive with students graduating from the Ivy League by teaching them the humanities. From those skills, law school, medical school, doctoral programs, and well-paid professions come. This is what we need to explain to our students. Majoring in criminal justice will not provide you with those skills. It gives you an occupation rather than giving you the skills to pursue a profession. It guarantees you job insecurity and income inequality. It multiplies your disadvantage. Yes, you might know what job you could get with that degree, but it is not a job you want, nor is it a job you could not have gotten without attending college. The second part of my argument is the idealist one. It hinges on the human part of the humanities. I am not perhaps the most personable individual. I enjoy reading and writing about a branch of 16th century magic so esoteric that even the people who read it at the time found it confounding. And while I very much enjoy teaching, I fully admit that I have to hit my on button several times at the start of every semester to remind myself that large groups of students are interesting and rewarding, not terrifying. When I stand at the front of that classroom or crouch squinting into my computer's camera for my Zoom class, as we all do now, I am struck immediately by the differences between myself and my students. They're so young. They're from 13 different countries. They represent a multiplicity of races, religions, and ethnicities. I am so white, and I'm such a stereotype. Androgynous lesbian academics are surely 12 for $1 in every university. But it only takes me 5 minutes to forget that. The study of history is the study of humans and humanness, and the history of medicine, perhaps more than any other subfield, underlines what we all have in common. Every single person here today, just like every student in my class, has already been a patient. Most of us were born in hospitals, but those who were not were brought into the world by a midwife or a doula's skilled hands. We have been vaccinated. You know how I know this? We're alive. And we have been shepherded through chickenpox, influenza, stomach flus, and colds by parents, older siblings, and medical professionals. We will wind up as patients again, of course. Our current pandemic reminds us that we are one COVID test away from an unpleasant, isolating existence that could end up with our struggling to breathe while we wait for a ventilator or trying to recover from the long-term effects of this complex and painful disease. We will all be caretakers too. Even if you choose not to have children, you will likely care for someone who is sick, your parents, your partner, your friends. If the ravages of AIDS in the American gay community in the 1990s taught us nothing else, it is that your friends are your family when the chips are down, you have a T-cell count of 7, and your parents are evangelical Christian Republicans who told you to pray away your gay. The act of caring for a loved one as she recovers, or does not, reminds us of our most human traits, love, kindness, patience. They are traits we share with every person who has ever sat by a bedside. Understanding the nuances of the history of medicine is certainly an interesting academic game, but grasping the tight cord of fragile kindness that binds modern healers and caretakers with those in the ancient world is far more compelling. We learn more about our humanness by sharing these experiences of love, of loss, of sorrow, and of joy with those who came before. This field of study also leaves us more open to the roles we share with those sitting around us. My students are not just my students. They are also people with sick children, grandparents with Alzheimer's, siblings born with congenital disease. Their role as caretakers renders them superhuman, multiplying their best characteristics and providing some explanation for their shortcomings. I have stood in front of classrooms and watched students click into this shared identity. I have seen them realize that the patients in the Tuskegee syphilis study could have been them, and that the immigrants denied admission to America because of their ethnicity, which was associated with eugenic weakness, are their families. These are the people we deny admission now, though under a slightly different rationale. Because not all medical history is sweetness and light. Some things we have done in the name of medical knowledge are revolting, as well as useless. Eugenics is, of course, my prime example of this. If this is not sufficient reason, however, to make you all sign up right now to study medical history, let me give you my final argument, which combines the first and second that I've already outlined. It has never been more important to be able to evaluate medical and scientific claims. Studying the humanities provides you with the vocabulary and logic to assess every sentence uttered by world leaders suddenly claiming to be leading experts about epidemic viruses. Studying the medical humanities gives you the knowledge base to not only evaluate those claims, but fact check them. Sign up for my introductory class in the history of medicine, and I promise you will leave with the ability to assess any epidemic news you encounter. This matters more than ever now. You have the opportunity every day to decide who is more correct. The World Health Organization, Dr. Fauci, an expert in infectious diseases, or President Trump, who has no science background and whose only motivation is political survival. Everyone needs the language and knowledge capital to assess those claims, and we are all perfectly capable of achieving them. They're available to anyone studying the history of medicine. I want to close with two quotes that demonstrate, for me, the urgency of teaching this field right now, whether we're doing it through Zoom or whether I ever get to stand in a classroom again in 2020 or maybe 2021. In 1983, Larry Kramer stood in a crowd in New York City and screamed, "Plague! We are in the middle of a plague, and you behave like this. Plague! 40 million infected people is a plague. Until we get our acts together, all of us, we are as good as dead." He was talking about AIDS. He was talking about safe sex. He was talking about a government that refused to fund any research into the HIV virus. He could have been talking about the plague in Venice in 1348, and he could have been talking about now. Until we change our behavior, which we will not do until we evaluate the scientific claims that contend wearing personal protective gear helps versus wearing personal protective gear is a freedom that you might want to exercise, but you might not, because then you would not support the Republicans. We cannot make good choices. And this is my final quote. In 1990, a film called Awakenings came out. It was based on Dr. Oliver Sacks's book of the same title, which discussed a strange viral epidemic and how one scientific experimental treatment was used to help people with encephalitis lethargica come back to life for some period of time. This is a quote from the mother speaking about the primary patient in both the film and the book. "When my son was born healthy, I never asked why. Why was I so lucky? What did I do to deserve this perfect child, this perfect life? But when he got sick, you can bet I asked why. I demanded to know why. Why was this happening?" And that is why we must teach the medical humanities. We will all ask why one day, and we should know we are a part of a large chorus whose query covers centuries, and we must know how to answer. Thank you very much for your time and for your invitation to present to this conference. It's a real honor. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot for this insightful presentation. And I was struck by one sentence of yours that we started as a patient and will be ending as a patient probably. I never thought about it, really. This is the first time. It's a kind of, okay, one epiphany for me that yes, we all started our life in hospital and probably will be ending it there. Thanks a lot for it. And as a student of humanities and a person who is teaching humanities courses, is trying to emphasize on the importance of humanities, I strongly believe that you have articulated our mind. We always try to help the institute understand the importance of humanities and how research and analytical skills are really required for our students to master their life. It is a kind of life skill that we can actually help our student to learn now. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this insightful presentation. And I would just like to share with the participants is Professor Allison Kavey is a professor of history at the Department of History in John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And both Professor Kavey and Dr. Ray Ellen Kavey have recently co-authored a book titled Viral Epidemics from Smallpox to COVID-19. So I believe it will come it will be published on September 2020. Am I right now? This is what I'm able to get through online information. So we look forward to read the book, and I strongly believe it will help us to enhance our understanding of how the entire human civilization is informed by the pandemics, and our understanding of civilization is evolving with the pandemic. That is a lived reality now. Thanks a lot, ma'am. Thank you. Participants, I now open the floor for questions.
Participants, you can unmute yourself and any observations, any questions, queries, you can ask the guests here.
Because this is a rare moment, I must say.
This is a rare moment. Yes.
Rare moment. A historian is here.
I would say a historical moment, you know, because
this is a historical moment for us.
Yes.
Definitely. Thank you, Dr. Borah. A historian and a medical practitioners have joined us to enlighten us about the present crisis.
I think, Dr. Karmakar, the presentation was very lucid, very clear. So I think our queries are less. That is why I think, because this was very lucid, very clear, very precise, succinct. So yeah, I would thank Allison Kavey and Ray Ellen Kavey for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot for joining us. And I'll just repeat, this is because of the unconditional academic support that we have received from both of you that we're able to make this event happen at this time of crisis. And I strongly believe, and I'm hopeful, we will be able to get future opportunities to collaborate and work with you further. Thanks a lot, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting us.
So probably we'll close the session.
Yes, we can join.
So participants will read
5:45.
Yeah. So we'll rejoin. We'll re-ask some. Okay, Rimi Nandi has a question, ma'am. Rimi Nandi, could you please kindly unmute yourself?
Rimi Nandi, you can unmute yourself and ask the question, please. Otherwise, you can use the chat box.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful presentation and giving us such an insight into medical humanities. I was just wondering, is there any way of connecting digital humanities and medical humanities? Is there any overlay between both the spheres?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and actually one that I'm working on right now with my colleagues in the group for early modern cultural studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. As I'm sure you're aware, resources like early English books online and the digitization of many library collections and special collections have allowed us to develop a research agenda that looks very different than when I started graduate school, when we used to, fly to a library and spend as much time as we could afford in the library looking at tiny books that were 300 or 400 years old in my case. I had the privilege of working in the British at multiple colleges at Oxford and in Cambridge. I no longer do that, not just because I'm lazy and have to work quite a bit more than I did as a graduate student at the university, but because almost every source I need is now available online. I, for example, have read, probably 35 versions of De Occulta Philosophia Libri Tres in different languages. And I did originally go and look at, I got grants and I was able to go to Europe and look at multiple versions of them, but I don't need to do that anymore. They were consistent. It demonstrates that the print marketplace was actually quite consistent in a way that was surprising. And so the digitization of these sources allows me now to work primarily from where you see now, my living room, or my office at the university, which has now been closed since March. So the digitization of sources is incredible. For the medical humanities, I must strongly encourage you to look at the incredible collection of resources on polio. This is, as you know, a worldwide epidemic, and there's an incredible archive of sources from all over the world detailing people's patient experiences with polio, practitioners' experiences treating polio in the first outbreaks that we know of in North America, the first big outbreaks in North America in the 50s, but also throughout the world. The WHO has extraordinary resources that our students are able to use, and also international students are able to access the CDC and its data collection. So I would encourage you to sort of play with your students on the internet and locate those sources, because they can be very fruitful in providing data for students to write good papers and interesting papers. As you can tell, I'm very interested in eugenics as well. And the eugenics sources are incredible. Every volume of the World Eugenics Journal is available online. And my students have to read a lot of them as part of my course. So I would encourage you to just try using Google or any other search engine to find relevant source material for the medical humanities. It's out there to a surprising extent. And I think this pandemic is making libraries and institutions even more likely to digitize more material. Thank you for a great question.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Rimi. Thank you, Professor Kavey, for responding to the question. I must say I am very much benefited by the internet.archive, the digital library, where most of the old books are available. And I have been reading and referring to those sources frequently. So yes, it's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. Any more questions? Anyone would like to ask anything to ma'am? Probably we can end the session.
Yes, Dr. Karmakar.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Professor Kavey. Thank you, Dr. Kavey, for your valuable time. Thanks a lot. And we are optimistic that once this pandemic ends, we will be able to bring you to our campus at Chennai.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay, so Dr. Borah, could you please just read the name of the presenters and we can get them ready for the...
So we'll start at 5:45, Dr. Karmakar.
Yeah, so this is